Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here today. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Allison Ruth, and I'm a Montgomery County Assistant District Attorney. And prior to serving the people of Montgomery County, I worked in Philadelphia. And that's where I had the privilege of getting to know Sergeant Robert Wilson III. He was an officer in the 22nd District in North Philadelphia, where he served for 8 years. I got to know Rob really well because he was an active police officer. And when you're active on the street, that means that you're in court most days. And despite being tired and working crazy hours, Rob was always in court with a big grin on his face. His smile was contagious, and he could make anyone laugh. If Rob wasn't at work, he was with his family. His dear grandparents who helped raise him, his sister Shakira, who was his best friend, and of course his 2 sons, which were his pride and joy. And in the few moments that Rob had to himself, he enjoyed riding motorcycles and supporting his beloved Green Bay Packers. We're not sure where that came from, since Rob was born and raised in Philadelphia, but that was his team. It was 6 years ago today when a massive snowstorm hit the city, and it actually shut down. Schools were closed, kids stayed home, the city was closed, government employees stayed home, but Rob put on his uniform and went to work, because officers don't get snow days. He was working with his partner, Officer Damian Stevenson, and they were patrolling North Philadelphia. They went to the area of 21st and Lehigh to conduct some security checks in the businesses located there. And Rob also thought while he went into the GameStop, he'd pick up a game for his son for some academic achievements he had at school recently. Because despite being at work, his kids were always on his mind. Officer Stevenson was driving that day and pulled up on the side of the GameStop, and Rob thought he'd be in there a couple minutes. It was only a minute or 2 later that 2 armed assailants came into the GameStop with their guns drawn. Rob, standing there in full uniform, immediately announced himself and exchanged gunfire with these 2 robbers. Rob actually drew attention away from the 7 employees and customers in that GameStop and engaged in a gun battle with these 2 robbers so that those civilians could get to safety behind the counter. Rob was able to exchange gunfire despite being struck multiple times until the final moment when he was hit in the head. But not one civilian was injured that day because of Rob's actions. Rob saved those people's lives. Officer Stevenson immediately, when he heard the gunfire, he ran towards the gunfire to check on his partner. He then exchanged in another gun battle with those 2 assailants who were fleeing from the GameStop, striking one of them, and the other cowardly ran back into the GameStop and tried to blend in with the civilians. Officers responded immediately, arrested the 2 assailants, and picked up Rob, put him in the back of their patrol car, and rushed down Broad Street towards Temple University Hospital as fast as they could despite the conditions. And the trauma surgeons there did everything they could, but despite their best efforts, Rob succumbed to his injuries. Rob made the ultimate sacrifice that day. And I won't begin to try to describe what the Wilson family has been through, this devastating loss, or what it's like for those 2 boys to grow up without a father. I only hope that the Wilson family will know and feel our support as we stand here today, and that someday those 2 boys will grow up knowing that even though their daddy didn't make it home that day, he made it possible so all those other moms and dads could make it home to their kids. Rob's death impacted everyone, including the community that he served. Members of the 22nd District came out in droves for the fundraisers we had for Rob and his family, and they even attended his funeral at the Palestra, as well as officers from near and far traveled to the Palestra to attend the funeral. They stood out in the pouring rain waiting so that they could pay their respects to him. Charles Ramsey was the police commissioner at the time. He came to Philadelphia after serving in Washington, D.C. and Chicago. He watched the video that day of Rob's bravery, said he had never seen anything like it, that Rob redefined what valor meant. Commissioner Ramsey decided to posthumously promote Rob Wilson to sergeant. He also decided to rename the Medal of Valor, the highest honor that a Philadelphia police officer can get. He renamed the Medal of Valor the Sergeant Robert Wilson III Medal of Valor for an extraordinary act of courage without regard to personal safety while engaged in actual combat with an armed and dangerous adversary. But it wasn't just police commissioner from Philadelphia. The following year, President Obama bestowed the Medal of Valor upon Rob and several other officers from across the country. Rob was the only one who couldn't be present that day, but his beloved grandmother, Connie, attended the ceremony at the White House and accepted the medal for him. Today, on the 6th-year anniversary of Rob's murder, I think it's more important now than ever to tell his story, to remember his sacrifice. While Rob's actions that day were, of course, heroic, that's not what made him a hero. How he died didn't make him a hero. It's how he chose to live. Rob believed that law enforcement was a vocation. He was called to serve and protect the people of Philadelphia, and that's what he did the day he gave his life. Rob left his family to protect and serve others' families. That's what police officers do every day. Rob and his partner Damien ran towards gunfire instead of away from it. That's what police officers do. And police officers leave their families every day not knowing if they'll make it back at the end of their shift. And tragically, that's what happened to Rob that day. There's a quote on the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial in Washington, D.C. that I've always found comforting, and I'd like to share it with you today. In valor, there is hope. Thank you, Sergeant Wilson, for your service.